So let's start on the front end, and let's start utilizing the answer to the question whether a user is authenticated or not there. For example, I want to make sure that the options in the header change based on whether we are authenticated or not. And again, Next.js makes that pretty easy for us. It is worth noting that after we logged in successfully, Next.js added a cookie. We can see this in the browser DevTools if we go to Application, Cookies, and select our domain. Here we see some cookies that were set, and these are cookies which are generated and managed by Next.js. For example, this session token is this JSON web token in the end. That was set automatically by Next.js when we logged in successfully. And it will also use that token automatically for us when we try to change what we see on the screen or when we try to send requests to protected resources. For example, we can get the answer to whether the user is logged in or not by finding out whether such a valid token exists. And we could come up with some code that allows us to do that manually, though that code would involve that we need to send that cookie to the server and let the server decide whether it's valid or not. And hence, it's good that we don't have to do that. Instead, if we want to find out if the user using this page at the moment is authenticated or not, Next.js gives us a convenient way of doing that. Let's say in our components, in the main navigation component, here I want to show profile only if the user is authenticated. Since we use NextAuth, all we have to do for that is we have to import something from NextAuth client, and that something now is the use session hook, which we can use in any functional React component. Here we can now call use session, and use session will return an array with exactly 2 elements. It is an array where the first element is the session object describing the active session, and the second element is loading, which tells us whether Next.js is currently still figuring out whether we are logged in or not. And for the moment, I'll just log both. I'll log loading and I will log session. If we do that and save this, and go back to the browser, to the console, and reload, we see true and undefined, and true and some object, and false in some object. The first log is always the loading state. So you see initially we're loading, we are finding out whether the user is authenticated or not, and hence we got no session object yet. Then at some point we're still loading, but we actually do have that object yet, and hence then loading is false, and we have that object still. And in that session object, we got that user data, which we encoded into our token. And we got some expiration date, which tells us when that session will expire automatically. Though it is worth noting that this session will be prolonged automatically if the user is active. So now that we know what's in there, what we can do is we can change what we see based on these 2 pieces of information. And we can make sure that the profile link is only showing up if we have a session. So not if we're still finding it out, and also not if we found it out but the answer is no. Only if we have a session, then we show this information in our header. So if I save this and reload, you see that profile flashes briefly because it's only loaded after a very short time duration once we found out that we do have a session, to be precise. Now that flashing could be unpleasant here, and I'll come back to how we can optimize all of that later in this section. But that generally is how we can find out whether we are authenticated or not. Now we can utilize this to then, for example, only show the login link if we don't have a session. Only if we don't have a session, we want to show the login link. I actually also don't want to show it whilst we're still loading though. So I want to show it only if we don't have a session and we're not loading. So if we're not loading and we then know that we have no session, then I want to show the login link. For the log out button, I only want to show that if we do have a session, because logging out only makes sense if we are logged in. With that out of the way, you see the login link is now gone. Now I am still on the login page because I can still visit that page. I'll show how we can prevent this later as well, but we now at least know how we can control what we see on the user interface. And that is an important first step. Now, before we dive deeper into route protection and how we can control which pages can be visited and how we can optimize all of that, let's first of all explore how we can log out so that we can also go back to log out state.